Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Valora Washington from the CAYL Institute, and we are very pleased that you've joined us today at the Community Advocates for Young Learners. It's always a pleasure to have you with us and to welcome you to this CAYL Catalyst series. And it is our goal to bring you timely, relevant, and immediately actionable topics of interest about young children and the people who care for them and work with them. So welcome, we're so glad you're here. Last year, we were delighted by the thousands of you who joined our inaugural webinar series, and so welcome back. And to those of you who are new to the series, we hope that you find them informative and enjoyable. Thank you so much for being a leader for children and the people who teach them and care for them. And thank you for being an architect of change for young children and the adults who work with them. For 2022, CAYL is going to focus on the theme of imagine, innovate, and impact. And for the next few months, we're going to focus on the idea of imagining what our field could be. Now, we know that when we say imagine, we often stress the importance of children's imagination, and we know that their imagination supports their development in so many ways, physically, emotionally, socially, and academically. But at CAYL, we believe that using our imagination is also a constructive way for all of us as adults to envision a different and a better future for young children and the people who teach them. And that's why last year our theme revolved around our book called Changing the Game for Young Children, which is what we all want to do. This year, we're emphasizing that the adults in children's lives can be architects of these positive changes that we want to see. And we're emphasizing CAYL's book about the new early childhood professional. So last month, we imagined universal childcare and universal preschool for children. And this month, we're going to imagine a stronger public policy framework for our children by looking at what other countries are doing and what we might learn for them. Tune in next month where we're going to imagine 21st century kindergarten. So join us today as we really talk about global perspectives on early childhood education. How is early childhood education being shaped around the world? Would we consider this conversation as a CAYL staff team? There was only one name that came to mind as the top expert on this topic, and that person is our field's legendary leader, Dr. Sharon Lynn Kagan. She is the Virginia and Leonard Marx Professor of Early Childhood and Family Policy and co-director of the National Center for Children and Families at Columbia University. And her distinguished career includes 225 articles, 13 books, all of her work which focuses on the institutions that impact child and family life. She is the recipient of many international and national honorary doctorates. She's a member of 40 boards and panels. She's the past president of NAEYC and Family Support America. And she is the only woman in the history of American education to receive 3 of the top most prestigious awards: the Distinguished Service Award from the Council of State School Officers, the James Bryant Conan Award for Lifetime Service to Education, and the Harold McCall Jr. Prize in Education. So we are thrilled to have Dr. Kagan with us today to share what she has learned and what the United States can learn from her groundbreaking international comparative studies of early childhood education. And following Dr. Kagan, and because CAYL also brings practitioners always to all of our webinars, we have 2 exceptional leaders with us today to describe the ECE landscape in their parts of the world. We have Dr. Samia Kazi, who's going to share her innovative work in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And we also have Dr. Samia Muriel Baskerville, who's going to share with us her work in Egypt and African nations. So thank you for joining us today. We want to notify you that this webinar is being recorded so that our colleagues in other time zones can enjoy it later. And we also encourage you to write in the chat with your questions and comments as we move along. And for those of you who may need closed captioning, that is a service that is also available to you. And so today we're going to imagine the leadership we need for children in early childhood education as we start with our current context. And so we're going to turn our attention to global perspectives on early childhood education. What are the lessons from the United States? What are the policy frameworks that we see in other countries? What are some of the implications for practice? What's going on with the idea of universal access and quality standards and family engagement? So join us as we hear from Dr. Kagan, Dr. Kazi, and Dr. Baskerville share with us what they're learning about early childhood education around the world. We're going to start off listening to Dr. Kagan, and from there we will hear Dr. Samia Kazi, followed by Dr. Baskerville, and then all of us will come together in a panel discussion. And stay tuned, because at the end of this 1-hour event, we are going to give you the opportunity to click a link, and when you click that link, you can join in an optional Q&A session with our panelists today if you would like to do so. So let's hear first from Dr. Sharon Lynn Kagan, who is going to be sharing with us some slides and teaching us what she's learned in these international studies, groundbreaking studies. Welcome, Lynn. We're so thrilled to have you.
Thank you, Valora, and hello and good afternoon or morning to all of our individuals who are on the line. Thank you, 101 of you, for joining us. We're delighted. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the incredible work that Valora Washington has done throughout her very, very, very strong career in early childhood. We've been friends and colleagues for a very, very long time, and I always learn from her and so appreciate the leadership that she affords to any organization or any endeavor that is lucky enough to be touched by her hands and her heart and her head. So Valora, hats off to you as a start. Second, as I am doing acknowledgements, I would like to thank Hannah Junis. Hannah is on this line, but she's also running these slides for me. She's been such an invaluable support as we have gone through a lot of journeys, learned a lot, and had a lot of fun together. So Hannah, thank you very, very much. And finally, my last thank you is to the National Center for Education and the Economy. You can see on this slide, we point the arrow to them because they are the people who have funded this particular study. And without them and their incredible generosity, we would not have been able to have conducted it. So thank you all. And with that, let us go to the next slide. I'm going to be covering in actually 7 parts today, a little bit of the rationale for this study, the commitment to always and ever learning from others. The next 4 sections are about kind of what we found from this long and detailed study. And finally, I'm going to make some recommendations for us to consider, perhaps as probes to a discussion that might ensue. Next slide, please. So let's begin with the rationale. Next slide, please. Valora said it well. We are really about trying to make social improvements for young children. And I have been guided by a friend and mentor, Julius Richmond, for a very long time. Julie ran what is now HHS. He was the noted pediatrician. He was the chairman of numerous foundations. And he summed up what it takes to make social change as a very, very simple formula. He said, all you really need is a really good knowledge base. You need strong public and political will, and you need a social strategy. Next slide, please. So I'd like to contend to you that we have the knowledge base. We know just about what we need to know. We know from the neuroscience, we know from the evaluation sciences of the peri-preschool and so many other effective programs. We know from the econometric sciences that investing in early childhood pays off. And we know from developmental science, pretty much what we should be doing. I'm not saying it's a perfect knowledge base, but it's a pretty well-developed knowledge base. So check off the first Richmond box. Second, next slide, please. What about public will and potential? Well, I couldn't have said this not a long time ago, but I have to say, if we look around, we are at an all-time high for public and political support for young children. We clearly have increased investments from communities and states, and indeed from the federal government. We have increased attention in the media. We have a lot of organizational support, and we're continuing to learn, and people are continuing to outreach to us. So in the United States, and I would also say globally, we really do have increasing support for the care and education of young children. So I guess that means, if you accept my premise, that we could sort of check off the second box. Next slide, please. What about the third box? What about social strategy? I will contend that I think we are very, very, very sorely amiss. That no matter what country you look at, we've got quality challenges. We've got challenges in equity, in who gets access to which programs. Most countries on this planet have huge fiscal challenges. How do they get enough money into the system? And no matter where you are on the planet, we've got systemic challenges. How do we make funding for children prenatally through age 8 that crosses all kinds of ministries, health, education, welfare, to really work and zing in a way so that we realize maximum efficiency and maximum outcomes for young children? I think that there's a lot of work to be done on social strategy. Next slide, please. Well, if you got a problem, it's pretty typical to try to learn from other people. Next slide, please. And so, along with the National Center for Education and the Economy, which is a group that is funded by the 50 largest corporations in America, they too are very interested in what other countries are doing in other ways. They've spent many studies about teacher education in K-12. And the second major international study they funded was this, to try to learn from the best countries and the best scholars. And so they fortunately came to me and said, design a study, figure it out. We want to learn from the best countries in the world. This in a way was a little bit of a challenge, not so much on the research side and how to design a study, but I have spent probably about 25 years of my life working in primarily low income and highly disadvantaged countries in Latin America, South America, Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, India, kind of all over the world. Looking at countries that were really, really doing a good job posed a little bit of a challenge, but I took it on and designed a study that actually had 4 goals. The first was, of course, to learn from best countries. The second was to use a systems-driven and highly contextualized orientation. Because if I've learned one thing in my work, it is that countries do things differently, and they all do it well. The third was to create this rigorous quality study. And the fourth was to produce findings that would be useful and to create products that would get this information into the public sphere. Next slide, please. So indeed, we went about it. And how do you identify the best countries? Well, it was hard, but given that we were responsible to business and industry, they, of course, always looked at the PISA, which is the international test of benchmarking for children. And so we too looked at that, and we took the 30 highest countries and we divided them into PISA high countries, PISA medium countries, and PISA low. Now, low meant only in the top 30. We know we've got about 200 countries in the world, so it's still pretty good. But that wasn't really the metric that I wanted to use, was how children perform on science and English and math studies. I really wanted to know, what did other people think about what was going on for quality for young children? And fortunately, we had just published the Economist Intelligence Report that really also looked at quality from a variety of parameters in early childhood programs. And so we linked from the Economist study, countries again on high, medium, and lower. That study looked at 45 countries. We took the top 30. And when we cross-hatched them, we got countries that appeared. Now, we couldn't do it in all the countries because although we had multiple millions of dollars, we didn't have enough to look everywhere. So we selected countries in different cells. We looked at South Korea because it was high on early childhood services and also high on PISA. We looked at Finland because it was very, very high on scores, a little bit high on the Economist. And we looked at England, we looked at Hong Kong, we looked at Singapore. And then you may be interested in why do we look at Australia as another country? And that's because having done a lot of work in Australia, I knew that as a country, it paid the best attention to addressing issues of diverse populations of any country on the planet. And that clearly is a problem in our system. So we landed on these 6 countries. Next slide, please. When I said we used a systems approach, this is an old heuristic, but many of you may be familiar with it. It says the countries around the world tend to focus on providing direct services to children and families. They may plant a patch of programs, in this case, flowers, that do family support and home visiting. They may plant another patch, often funded through a different ministry, on early childhood education and care. They may plant health, nutrition, and mental health programs, and so on. And they plant and plant all of these programs. But all the while, those programs are not achieving the kinds of goals because, as any farmer or horticulturalist knows, if you plant too many things without nurturing the soil, providing sun and providing water, you end up having flowers that actually die. We contend that that is the case, and we call upon countries and governments to really address the infrastructure that supports early childhood programs or to take care of the soil. Next slide, please. So what is that infrastructure? Well, it's how we engage with families and communities, how we use data, how we finance programs, how we govern these programs, how we make transitions, how we provide for quality via program inspection and regulation, and how we support caregivers via training and professional development. We contend, and we use this mechanistic graphic because we contend that these are all related. And next slide, please. We believe that if you take any one of those gears away, you end up with not of a system. So we took a systemic approach and we examined all of those issues as we were designing our protocols. The third thing we did was to create a very rigorous quality study that had clear research questions. It began with a document review of policy studies, and we did very, very solid data analyses. I want to say that I was lucky enough to work with the very top researchers in each of these countries, each of whom has had a profoundly impactful research career, has impacted government policies, and each of whom has experience working with young children and their families. So we had quite a stellar team. Next slide, please. And our goal was to create products, and indeed we did that. There are books that have emanated from this study. There are case studies of every country that can be found online. So if you are interested in delving in greater depth into anything I'm saying, those data are all available on the NCEE website. Next slide, please. So what did we find? Our goal was to produce useful findings. And indeed, we found 4, and that's going to be the focus of the rest of my remarks. Next slide, please. The first finding, not really a surprise, but very profound. It is that context reigns. Context is all important. Next slide. We purposely, when we selected the countries, selected those who were Nordic, had a Nordic approach, those that were Asian in orientation, and those that were Anglo. The Nordic was Finland, the Asia was Singapore and Hong Kong and South Korea, and the Anglo was Australia and Britain. And you know what? Those initial hunches paid off. These approaches look very different. Heavy, very, very heavy public funding in the Nordic countries, moderate to heavy public, but combined with a very rich private provision in the Asian countries. And in Anglo countries, it's limited, actually, public funding and does rely on the private sector. We found that attitudes varied regarded to program monitoring, how much and how little, to different forms of accountability. And actually, the content of the curriculum varied dramatically, and how they approached raising young children varied dramatically. Next slide, please. Let me give you a couple of examples. So in Finland, there is a tremendous trust in the government, something that doesn't exist all over the world. And there is a commitment to universal provision via a very, very strong socialist orientation and a very strong commitment to community. Indeed, in Finland, there is very limited monitoring and accountability. They don't monitor their teachers. They don't test and monitor children. And they have a wide array of community-based public services. Singapore is a country, many of you who've been there, you know that Singapore came into being really in a comparatively short time, my lifetime, in fact. It has done so by really embracing a spirit of innovation. It borrows rapidly from other countries. It rapidly expands services once it is convinced. It has, in a way, a benevolent dictator who really cares and who you can get things done with very, very, very quickly. They create pilot programs and they scale. The other interesting thing about Singapore is that it does very effectively blend three very, very strong and different religious and cultural traditions. Australia, different. I mentioned its diversity and its real commitment to Indigenous and immigrant populations. I'm not saying things are perfect in Australia, but I am saying that with more intentionality, they have addressed this issue, I think, better than any other country. And that is manifest in everything they do for young children. So these contexts set the stage for the way these countries approach what they are doing with young children. How much testing they do, how much monitoring they do, how much money they invest, how they govern, and what the content of the early childhood programs turns out to be. Next slide, please. So remember context. The second lesson is that there are multiple bests in all of these countries. Next slide, please. It was very interesting, and I would ask you to think about your own home countries as you listen to this. Every single one of these countries had very strong pre- and perinatal services. They all have paid family leave, with many having specifically for fathers. They all have some form of subsidized health care. They all have some form of home visiting. Second, they all really support infants and toddlers. Most of them have subsidies for low-income at-risk families, and most of them have some kind of ongoing support for parenting. South Korea, because it has, well, maybe I'll get into this in a minute, but South Korea has a very interesting approach to comprehensive services that was recently inaugurated for all of its 2-year-olds throughout the country. They all have programs for preschoolers, and they don't just concentrate on preschool like we are so hot on universal pre-K. That would never be an approach that any one of these countries indeed would seek to employ. They understand that beginning early is important. And also something that we in America don't focus on, they all pay attention to transitions. They recognize that bringing children from home into group care is a transition, that moving from small group centers to large group centers and then into schools is a very, very big issue. And they all support transition efforts and have many, many different exciting ways to carry this out. Next slide, please. Here we go. Here's some examples of multiple bests. Finland, comprehensive services at peri and prenatal that promotes parental choice. You can have your child in a drop-in center that's located in your community where a parent comes. You can have your newborn child up to a year at home using no services at all. You can have your newborn child in a childcare program. They also develop individualized education plans, something that we in the United States do for children with special needs. They say no, 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 no. We want it for every child because every child is an individual. Teachers must develop them. They don't look exactly like our IEPs do, but they pay attention to the individual. In England, replete with a very strong history of an inspection system, they don't think anything about collecting data on program quality. You'd never see program quality being done in Finland, a data collection. England does it. They do it rigorously. They collect data on 2-year-old children in a national data set, something that we and other countries would not even think about. They also wouldn't think about developing curriculum for children 3 to 5. They do it for children birth to 8 and provide for transitions. Singapore, consolidated governance that is focused. They've created a new department for ECEC because they recognize how multi-sectoral this is. And they have a very elaborated single unified career ladder for everybody. They indeed have one set of, it's got 4 tiers, not unlike what the NAYC unifying framework is. And they pay everybody in those slots pretty much the same, irrespective of where they are working and what kind of program. They provide all kinds of incentives for career advancement. Australia engages with families and with Indigenous communities. They've developed the most important national quality framework, the NQF, that everybody should take a look at. Hong Kong, I could go on, but you're getting the idea that none of these countries look alike in the exact services they provide. And finding one, how the context contours it, you can see that it's manifest in all of these different approaches. Next slide, please. The infrastructure. Next slide, please. We identified, as opposed to those 7 or 8 gears, 15 things that are needed if you are promoting and want to have a good infrastructure. Next slide, please. The first is strong policy foundations. You would never be able to have a quality early childhood program if you didn't have a fairly stable government and if you didn't have policies that were applied across diverse programs. None of the standards for Head Start and standards for childcare and standards for other programs. You just don't see that. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip back because we're running a little bit short on time. Next slide. We would never see programs that would be high quality if they didn't have comprehensive services, funding, and governance. Next slide, please. Indeed, we see a lot of services that are provided that many times they provide them to everybody. If they don't, they provide to a large segment of the population and then layer on extra services for children who demonstrate special needs. They all have coordinating mechanisms and governance systems that work. Next slide, please. They all have knowledgeable and supported teachers and families. Next slide. And they understand that the teaching force is the core of the workforce. They well prepare them, they well compensate them, they respect them, and they engage families very, very meaningfully and appropriately. They also take care to fund and support pedagogical and administrative leadership. Next slide, please. They all have continuous individualized pedagogy. Next slide, please. And indeed, they articulate child-centered principles. They individualize for all. And as I noted earlier, they provide for a continuity in children's experience. The data that we have supply thousands of examples of these. Next slide, please. Finally, they all use data to foster improvements. Next slide, please. They produce child data. And aside from Finland, they're not frightened of doing it. They monitor what they are doing in terms of programs and also in terms of teacher training, with England being the exemplar of the most intense approach to monitoring. But interestingly, they all have national institutes of early childhood research, where that research is done. These are government sponsored. They are very, very well funded. It supports scholars to do research on young children. And this research then is used to improve programs. Next slide, please. And the fourth finding, it's not just that we have those pillars, next slide, please, but that we work to affect synergy amongst them. In other words, these don't stand as isolated boxes. Let me give you an example. Next slide, please. If we wanted to focus on pedagogy, next slide, please, we would see that they use that pedagogical curriculum to individualize instruction. Next slide. We use the pedagogy to promote continuity. Next slide, please. We use it to collect data. In other words, we're collecting data on what we want for children. We use it to collect program data. Next slide. We use it as the pillar on which to train the workforce. So it doesn't sit on some shelf and it's just curriculum alone. We use it on how to engage families. You get the gist. There is synergy amongst these cells. Next slide, please. Use it for funding. Next slide. Keep going. Same thing is true with child data and program data. We link it to all sorts of other resources so that when we are collecting data, we are building. We're not just collecting data on what people in Princeton think is important, but it's predicated on what the community thinks and what has been committed to by the early childhood profession. Next slide, please. So what do we recommend after all of this? Next slide, please. Basically, we have got a need for some fresh action. We need to understand that we need clear and consistent definitions of what is early childhood education and care and what is comprehensive education development. We get in a bind because we don't know if we're talking about health and education and welfare, if we're talking just about childhood care and education. The second is that we need to think of the effectiveness of what we are doing as having effects on the provider. We need to measure equity and equitable access. We need to measure the sustainability of our efforts. And I believe we need to be cost efficient and measure the efficiency of our investments in terms of time and in terms of resources and in terms of how we are using our workforce. Next, we need to recognize that there is no one best, that your bests are created when you adhere to these processes, but that every country's best will be contoured by its own context. Finally, there is a great deal to be learned from all of these countries, both in terms of the general principles that I've enunciated, but also in terms of very specific strategies. And I think next slide, I will end there, except to say that I'm appreciative of the time together and I'm looking forward to our questions and to your questions so that I can elaborate on some of these. And now I would like to turn it over to Samia, who is going to report from a very, very important part of the world that I love and that was not included in the study. Samia.
Thank you so much. So today I'm going to take you on a journey, kind of flipping between 2009 and 2020 were the times that I was living and working, to give you an idea about kind of the evolution of early childhood in the Middle East. So before I start, I want to tell you that my educational background is kind of split between computer science and between my master's and doctoral work in early childhood, and also my love of early childhood research, which I focused on as well. And I'll tell you why those two are important. And it was difficult for me to kind of think about what I can tell you in like 9 or 10 minutes today, but I chose to, I'm going to focus on 3 areas. So we'll talk a little bit about the political arena. I'll tell you a little bit about teacher preparation in the Middle East, and then I'll tell you about families and culture. So let's start with families and culture because it kind of paints a nice picture so you can kind of see what it felt like for those of you who haven't lived there. In 2009-ish and before, most families didn't really know what early childhood centers kind of were. Some did, but they didn't really understand what the good of early childhood was for. They didn't understand what the importance of brain development and high quality childcare programs. And a lot of them, they didn't know why they shouldn't just rely on nannies at home, right? And which, by the way, all families past tense had. I'm not getting into rights and wages conversation here, but then closer to 2010, 2015, and you'll notice that kind of these dates are very close together because the shift and change was happening very fast. So in 2015, as moms became more aware, they wanted to go back to school, they wanted to go to work, they felt a lot of shame, most of which was associated sadly, to mothers. I remember watching a vlog of an influencer shaming some women who were dropping off their kids at childcare program. But that very quickly changed. So fast forward to now, moms are looking for the best. They're looking for high quality early childhood programs. They're looking for international accreditation. They're paying attention to how the teachers are trained in childcare programs, looking at the quality of indoor, outdoor environments and so forth. But of course, only for those who can afford it. Majority of the childcare programs still, they're privately run. So there are many struggling working moms, just like how we have in other parts of the world. And sadly, a lot of working moms had to resort to, illegal care or accept lower quality of childcare programs. And I want to note here that every mom wants the best for her children, whether they're a Middle Eastern mom or an American mom. But sometimes, your culture, your habits, your nationality, it makes other people's view kind of distorted or blurry to think, and despite what the media might say, I was born, I was raised there, I worked there up until 2018. Not all women are oppressed in the Middle East. So many women were kind of, especially 10, 15 years ago, there was this feeling of that women were taken care of. Fathers, governments, husbands, brothers had the responsibility to take care of the women and children, which is not really bad if you think about it. So now keep that in mind, and let's kind of move into the other second area that I want to talk to you about, which is the political arena. So where this feeling of expectancy kind of continues. So I worked as a consultant with almost every government or entity that had anything to do with children. I spent time with the social affairs people, education, municipality, when we worked on zoning issues, law enforcement, when we worked on child protection issues, family affairs. And just like a traditional parent-child kind of relationship, there was this expectancy that you want to be taken care of by the government. But then things, they started to change at, again, a very fast and vast growth. There were so many more entrepreneurs with the growth of social media, English language. I mean, you might be shocked to hear that Middle Eastern governments send hundreds and thousands of their young citizens to the top universities around the world. And then they pay for their education, and then they pay for their housing, and they expect them to come back and serve in their countries. Well, this caused a very big shift in the early childhood sector. So I remember with the growth of entrepreneurship at some point in 2010, when we were running a teacher training institute, there were 13 training centers that offered the exact same early childhood teacher training in one little city in the Middle East. So these entrepreneurial efforts were not just with childcare, also childcare programs. I think there was like a growth of 500% in one of the years. And then this entrepreneurial effort, it was everywhere. It was related to even freelancers and innovators kind of coming up with new software or curriculum or toys or everything related to childhood. But what I witnessed is the problem, instead of these evolving entities, whether they were government or private or public, they, instead of seeing themselves as an important part of an early childhood system, I felt like they mistakenly thought that instead they were kind of tasked to solve the challenge for the entire sector. Because I don't feel that they were system thinkers or system doers. There was a lot of role confusion. So every time there was a new training center that came out, the view would always be, how can I compete instead of collaborate? Every time there would be a new department in a government, they would be like, okay, I need to fix the whole sector, or rather, how can I build upon people who came before me? So organizations, including government, private, public, they spent more on marketing than they did on programs. I witnessed so much duplication of efforts, wastage of resources, unhealthy competition. So that gives you a little bit about the political arena. So now let's turn a little bit to teacher preparation, which is an area that I spent a lot of my time in. So in 2009, we started a workforce analysis study. And we found in one of the small cities in the Middle East, and it revealed to us that 95% of adults who worked with young children didn't even have a 5-hour workshop to prepare them for their role. So based on that, I mean, we got really excited. We started a teacher training institute, and we implemented a multi-year systems-based strategy as a private entity. And we luckily, you know, we were able to affect the policy. The policies and the requirements for teacher preparation changed from requiring 30 hours to requiring 120 hours to now it is required for them to get at least a diploma or an associate's degree to be able to be a lead teacher in an early childhood program. And this year we surpassed, I think, 14,000 learners, which are mostly women, which I'm especially proud about. And I've seen with my own eyes that just like moms, every teacher, wherever they are, they want the best for their children too. I've seen, of course, most of the all of early childhood teachers in the Middle East are women. And I've seen female teachers, superheroes, that against all odds, without any access to scholarship, any access to financial support, they fought to get the education, the respect, and the job that they deserve. Whether they were fighting, struggling financially or struggling within their cultural family, whatever it was. And I also want to point out that during this time, Valora played a big part in my professional work as well. You know, Valora wasn't just a business associate. She was my mentor and advisor at many times. Valora, I remember every sentence you ever told me, and I worked very hard to implement every piece of those advice in my daily work. So finally, I want to say that because of all of that experience and the struggles and the things that I learned about the importance of systems and the importance of partnerships, now we're not just running one training institute, but we've partnered with 12 providers in 8 different countries around the world. I did a backflip and brought my love for computer science and tech back. And so for the past 2 years or 2.5 years, we've been building the first ever multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral, multilingual platform for adults and organizations serving children. We're kind of like, I like to say, we're system thinking in practical terms. So, and you know, when I say technology, I'm not like for using tech with children, but what I am for is that I think that we need to use technology to start solving our policy level challenges. I think that we need to use technology to start reducing wastage of money on ads and administration, and instead giving that money back to our teachers. We need to stop overlapping the programs that we're doing and then save money on that, and then let our parents enjoy those savings. And most of all, also, we need to give a chance to the freelancers and to people who are innovating and give them a fair shot at showing up and taking the stage against these bigger organizations that come in and deliver programs on the wide scale. So, you know, if you think about it, look at the real estate sector, the health sector, the tech sector, the business sector. These sectors are advanced because they're using advanced technologies to solve problems in their sector. And in early childhood, we're behind. We need to catch up. We need to catch up. I know that as early childhood, and when other people start talking about blockchain and artificial intelligence, you're like, no, I'm against that. Yes, I'm not saying that using those things with young children, but I do see that a lot of the issues, a lot of the challenges that I felt in the Middle East, some of those could be solved properly using technologies to innovate platforms and ecosystems for better learning and better multi-stakeholder partnerships. So with that, thank you so much. I want to thank all the teachers and moms and child advocates who are here today. And I think that's my time, and I'm handing it over to Dr. Samira.
Thank you, Samia, and thank you, Dr. Kagan. You both gave a very wonderful synopsis of the state of early childhood, and I definitely appreciate. I took notes. I took a lot of notes because I really appreciate the feedback and the information that was provided by both of you. But I need to take you on a different type of journey that I experienced in Egypt and on the continent of Africa since I moved here in 2016. I actually thought I had retired and got here and arrived in Egypt, and after about a year got very bored and decided to see if there was anyone who could possibly use my skills and abilities in the education sector in Egypt. So I was hired by a very visionary leader and owner of the largest private school provider in Egypt. And on the very first day we met, I was tasked with improving the foundation stage of the over 26 private schools that he had in the country of Egypt. And so I took some time and went into some of the schools and began to observe in the classrooms and speak with the teachers and the directors. And after about 6 months or so, came to the conclusion that in order to bring about any, the beginning of any systemic change, that there was going to have to be a shift in the mindset of the teachers who were in the classrooms. That there was really not going to be, we couldn't come from the perspective of the political and social will, because as Samia alluded to, the political and social will in these countries is not, it's very different in context than the US and European countries. The whole cultural context is, I can appreciate it, but it is very different. And so in order to bring about any change in these classrooms, I thought it was necessary and to bring about the change in the mindset of those providing the services, direct services to the children. One of the biggest phenomena that I found here in the foundation stage, which is the pre-K, KG1 and KG2, or pre-primary classroom settings, was that all of the teachers possess college degrees. All of them have finished some four-year university school in some discipline. Unfortunately, only about 5% of those have actually had any training, formal training and education in how to teach. They come from the School of Nursing, the School of Pharmacy, the School of Engineering, the School of Commerce, English language, Arabic language, and very few of them possess any skills and competencies in how to work with young children in the classroom. And so this is when I embarked upon developing a teacher training program here in concert with an organization that certified and credentialed early childhood educators. And so for the past 3.5 years, we spent time training over 230 early childhood educators, both in Egypt and in Ghana. One of the things that became very apparent over these 3.5 years was the profound impact that these trained teachers were having in the classrooms, in the environment of their classrooms, with the interactions with the children, and it began to trickle. It began to trickle around, so to speak, and the interest in this particular training grew exponentially. We had a little downtime or 18-month hiatus during the outbreak of the COVID. However, when we resumed this past summer, we had over 80 teachers who took the comprehensive summer 5-week training in the summer of 2021. What we are embarking upon now, and I like the fact that Dr. Kagan talked a lot about contextualizing, because what we found was that the teacher training program that we used was primarily originated out of the United States. And we contextualized it to a certain degree in order to train these teachers. But we found we needed to go even a step further. And so at Badr University, where I am employed, we have decided to move towards, or we have begun to move towards developing our own teacher credentialing program here in Egypt and making it an international credential, primarily serving the Middle East and North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. And not only are we tasked with developing that program for the foundation stage teachers, we are also working with developing a teacher training for the primary, preparatory, and secondary levels. This particular training for the early childhood educators became so popular that, and so much in demand, that I was approached both by my employer as well as directors from schools about why couldn't we use this same framework in training teachers at the upper levels. And so this is what we have embarked upon now. It's been very challenging but rewarding work. And it's here in this part of the world, it's the way it sort of seems in reverse with respect to the manner in which Dr. Kagan and Samia talked about the social and political will. And, you know, I've had to really utilize the vision of you know, my employer to push the agenda from the bottom up, so to speak, from in the classroom with the teacher, and sort of provide the evidence that this is what really works. And it's very interesting to hear Dr. Kagan elaborate on the studies that were done in those 6 countries. What I have been pushing for and have written a couple of proposals is for us to conduct a study here in Africa, or, you know, in these classrooms of these 230 educators in Africa, in Egypt and in Ghana, and provide the evidence that the training the teachers is where the beginning of this systemic change is going to happen, based on the child learning outcomes that they're able to produce, positive child learning outcomes they're able to produce as a result of having been trained. And so that is sort of the direction that we've had to take here, as opposed to going directly to the ministries and the government officials and trying to persuade. We need to produce the evidence right there on the ground in order to persuade or to influence the political will in this part of the world. It reminds me very much of when I started out as an early childhood educator eons ago, and we were looked at as glorified babysitters, and that terminology has been used often. And then the study from neurons to neighborhood hit the fan over 20 years ago. And all of a sudden there was scientific evidence to support what we were doing in those classrooms, and the recognition began to happen. So it is very much what will need to happen here in Egypt and in Africa is that the evidence will have to be created or will have to be found right in the classroom with the practitioners, and for us to produce that evidence to then go and influence the political will. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to the CAYL Institute and Dr. Valor, and thank you so much. She's also been a friend and a mentor to me as well. And I have enjoyed very much working with her. And even she visited us twice. And so everyone still asks about her and look forward to seeing her again. And I want to thank you for this opportunity.
Absolutely. I am so inspired by what I've heard from Dr. Kagan and Dr. Samia and Dr. Samia. Thank you so much for sharing. Because of the limited time that we have right now, we are going to reserve the question answer period to what is going to happen next. So if you're interested in having and participating in an optional question answer with our panelists, there will be a link in the chat that you can click and you can join in the conversation. But we really want to thank all of you for joining us in this series. We understand that as we're thinking about early childhood education around the world, we have to make sure we're always focused on the cultural relevance, the policy foundation, and as we've heard, so important to support the practitioners. So we want to let you know that next month, we're going to continue our conversation about how we can really innovate and imagine a new world for our children. We're going to talk about 21st century kindergarten. And then following that in May, we're going to talk about how governments are stepping up for. We really want to thank for joining us today. And I want to thank our team that is always putting these webinars together. Thank you, Ivy, Brenda, Amanda. Very much appreciate your support. And I'm going to encourage all of you at this moment to remember that you can look forward to our follow-up email for the resources. If you want to dig deeper into our topic today, you can continue to put in the chat, and please join us in this follow-up conversation with our panelists. Thank you so much for joining the CAYL Institute once again, and we look forward to continuing our dialogue with you throughout 2022. Good night.